Everything's fine. The baby was calm. The room was quiet. Then the dog stood up. If you've ever watched a dog react before danger was obvious, stay with this story. And if you trust animals to sense what we can't, leave a comment with your dog's name and subscribe, because this one begins in total safety and turns in a single movement. The room felt settled, not busy, not tense, just comfortably finished with the day. The kind of quiet that comes when routines are working and nothing needs attention. No alarms, no sharp sounds, no reason to look twice. Claire sat on the floor with her daughter, Ivy, propped happily between her legs. Ivy was 9 months old, steady enough to sit, curious enough to lean, smiling at everything as if the world had already proven itself trustworthy. A soft blanket covered the rug. Toys were scattered in a loose circle, nothing sharp, nothing heavy, everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Across the room, the dog lay down. Nolan had been there most of the afternoon, stretched out near the wall, chin on his paws, breathing slow and even. The posture of a dog with nothing to worry about. Claire barely noticed him anymore. She was watching Ivy clap her hands and squeal at the sound, delighting in the simplest thing. "You're so proud of yourself," Claire laughed softly. From the kitchen, her partner Mark rinsed dishes, listening to the familiar rhythm of laughter and quiet behind him. Everything sounded normal. Then Nolan stood up, not suddenly, not nervously. He simply rose to his feet. Claire noticed it immediately and frowned. Nolan didn't stretch, didn't shake, didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead. At Ivy. Claire's smile faded. "What is it?" she asked lightly. "You okay, buddy?" Nolan didn't respond. Ivy leaned on forward, still smiling, reaching for a toy just out of reach. And Nolan took one step closer. Nolan didn't bark. That was the first thing Claire noticed. He didn't rush, didn't whine, didn't do anything dramatic enough to trigger panic. He just stood there, completely still, his body angled toward Ivy, his eyes locked on her small movements with an intensity Claire had never seen before. Ivy leaned forward again, still smiling, still unaware. Her fingers brushed the edge of the blanket as she shifted her weight, balance wobbling just slightly in the way babies do when confidence outruns coordination. Claire noticed the shift a half-second too late. Did come in pause. Nolan moved. He crossed the space between them in two long strides and placed himself directly in front of Ivy, his body blocking her forward motion just as her balance tipped. "Hey, wait," Claire started, reaching out instinctively. Ivy pitched forward. Not a fall, not a dramatic lurch, just enough. Nolan lowered his chest and pressed it firmly against Ivy's legs, stopping her momentum and nudging her backward at the same time. Ivy toppled onto her diapered bottom with a startled cry, the smile vanishing instantly. The toy skidded across the rug. Claire lunged forward and scooped Ivy up, heart slamming. "Oh my God, are you okay?" she whispered, running her hands over Ivy's arms, her head, her back. "You're okay, you're okay." Ivy cried loudly for a few seconds, angry, surprised, alive, then buried her face into Claire's shoulder. From the kitchen, Mark rushed in. "What happened?" "She tipped," Claire said breathlessly. "Nolan, he—" She stopped mid-sentence. Nolan wasn't looking at them. He was staring at the floor, at the space just beyond the edge of the rug. Claire followed his gaze. At first, she didn't see it. Then she stepped closer, and her stomach dropped. The hardwood floor beyond the rug glistened faintly under the light, just enough to matter. A thin sheen of liquid spread outward in a narrow arc, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. "Oh my God," Claire whispered. Mark crouched and ran his hand across the floor. His palms slid unexpectedly. "It's wet." The sippy cup, they'd filled it earlier and left it on the coffee table. It must have tipped over without either of them noticing, leaking slowly, silently, spreading just far enough to reach the rug's edge. If Ivy had crawled forward, her hands would have slipped, her knees would have gone out, her head would have hit the hardwood edge. Claire hugged Ivy tighter, her hands shaking now that the danger had revealed itself. "You stopped her," she whispered, looking at Nolan. "You stopped her." Nolan stayed where he was, blocking the wet floor. Mark grabbed towels and dropped to his knees, wiping up the spill quickly. As he cleaned, the cloth slid easily beneath his hand. "That would have been bad," he said quietly. Claire nodded, unable to speak. She lowered Ivy back onto the blanket, keeping her hands close this time. Ivy blinked, then smiled again. Resilient, trusting, reaching for another toy like nothing had happened. Nolan didn't lie back down. He stayed standing, watching. Ivy leaned forward again, scooting closer to the edge of the rug. Nolan stepped sideways and blocked her path. No contact, no pressure, just occupying the space she was about to enter. Ivy bumped gently into his leg and laughed, patting his chest like it was part of the game. Claire's heart pounded. "He's not reacting," she whispered to Mark. "He's predicting." Mark nodded slowly. He didn't wait. They moved the rug back a few inches, just to be safe. Nolan adjusted his position with it. Ivy crawled toward the couch next, pulling herself upright with effort. Her feet slipped slightly on the blanket. Nolan was already there. He pressed his shoulder against Ivy's side, stabilizing her until she found her balance again. Ivy laughed. Claire didn't. "She almost went," she said quietly. Nolan stepped back half a pace, but didn't relax. A moment later, Ivy reached up and tugged hard on the couch cushion. It shifted forward. Nolan barked once, sharp, precise. Mark reacted instantly, grabbing the cushion just as a heavy remote slid out from underneath and dropped onto the rug, right where Ivy's head would have been. Mark stared at the remote, then at Nolan. "He warned us." Claire covered her mouth. "That would have hit her." Nolan sat down between Ivy and the couch, guarding. They spent the next half hour like that, every movement slower, every reach scrutinized. When Ivy crawled toward the hallway, Nolan repositioned himself. When she leaned too far, reaching for a toy, Nolan blocked the space. When Claire stood to grab water, Nolan stayed with Ivy, not her. Claire noticed that too. "He's not following us," Mark swallowed. "He's following the risk." By the time the afternoon light softened and shadows stretched across the floor, Claire felt exhausted in a way she hadn't expected. Not from activity, from awareness. Nolan still hadn't lain down. He stood near Ivy, calm, alert, watching every small shift of her body like it mattered. Because it did. And whatever had made him stand up in the first place wasn't finished testing them yet. They didn't say it out loud, but something had changed. Claire stayed seated on the floor with Ivy longer than usual, her legs stiff beneath her, one hand always hovering close enough to catch without touching. Mark finished wiping the spill and stood there for a moment, towel dangling from his hand, scanning the room like it had just betrayed him. Nolan didn't lie down. He stayed upright, alert, his body positioned between Ivy and the slick floor even after it had been dried. When Mark slid the rug back into place, Nolan adjusted his stance with it, recentering itself as if the exact boundary mattered. Ivy crawled toward a basket of toys near the couch, squealing happily when one tipped over and spilled its contents. Nolan moved with her, not hovering, not frantic, tracking. When Ivy pulled herself upright using the side of the couch, her feet slipped slightly on the blanket. Nolan stepped in immediately. He pressed his shoulder gently against her hip, giving her a solid point to lean into until she found her balance again. Ivy laughed, delighted by the contact, patting Nolan's fur like he was part of the game. Claire's chest tightened. "I didn't even see her slip." Mark nodded. "Neither did I." Nolan stepped back half a pace but stayed close. A few minutes later, Ivy reached up again and tugged harder on the couch cushion. It shifted loose. Nolan barked once. Short, sharp. Mark reacted instantly, grabbing the cushion before it could fall. As he lifted it, a hard cover book slid out from underneath and dropped to the floor with a heavy thud, right where Ivy's face would have been. Mark stared at the book. "That would have," Claire finished it for him, "hit her." Nolan sat between Ivy and the couch, guarding. Ivy crawled away unbothered and headed toward the coffee table. She reached for its edge, fingers stretching toward a dangling coaster. Nolan stood instantly. He placed his body between Ivy and the table, blocking her path without touching her. Ivy bumped gently into his leg and sat back, confused, then laughed and crawled in a different direction. Claire watched closely now. "He's redirecting her." Mark nodded slowly, without scaring her. The pattern repeated itself over and over. When Ivy crawled toward the hallway, Nolan repositioned himself. When she leaned too far, reaching under the table, Nolan blocked the opening completely. When Claire stood to grab water from the kitchen, Nolan stayed with Ivy, not her. Claire noticed that too. He's not following me. Mark swallowed. He's following what could hurt her. By mid-afternoon, the house had entered a different rhythm. Claire moved slower. Ivy explored, but within invisible limits. Nolan watched everything. When Ivy grew tired, her movements became less coordinated. She lunged instead of crawling. She reached without looking. Her balance wavered more often. Nolan stayed closer, always within reach. At one point, Ivy crawled toward the hallway again. Nolan stood instantly and planted himself in front of it. Claire frowned. The floor's dry. Nolan didn't move. Mark stepped closer and noticed it immediately. The transition strip between the rug and hardwood had loosened slightly from the earlier moisture. One edge lifted just enough to catch a crawling hand. Mark pressed it with his foot. It flexed. That would have bited her down hard, he said quietly. Claire felt a chill spread through her. He wasn't guarding the spill. Mark nodded. He was guarding what came after. Later, Ivy pulled herself upright against a low side table near the window. Nolan stood up again. Claire sighed softly. What now? She stepped closer and noticed the stack of mail and a ceramic dish near the edge. Things she'd set there earlier without thinking. She moved them away just as Ivy tugged experimentally on the table leg. A moment later, the table wobbled. Claire's breath caught. Okay. Nolan sat down again, satisfied for now. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion crept in, not physical, but emotional. Claire realized her shoulders ached from being tense for so long. She sat back against the couch. I can't believe how much we missed. Mark watched Nolan adjust his stance as Ivy changed direction. I don't think we missed it, he said slowly. I think it just hadn't happened yet. Ivy crawled toward the base of the stairs at the far end of the hall. The baby gate stood closed, familiar, trusted. Nolan stood instantly. Mark moved toward the gate and tested it with his hand. It shifted, barely, but enough. Mark tightened the mount, pressing until it felt secure again. Nolan remained standing until Mark finished. Only then did he relax slightly. Claire carried Ivy upstairs for a nap later, her heart still pounding as the day replayed itself in fragments. The spill, the book, the table, the gate. None of it loud. All of it dangerous. Downstairs, Nolan lay near the foot of the stairs, eyes open, ears tuned, because standing up once hadn't been enough. He was still working. Night didn't relax the house. It compressed it. The lights were dim. The television stayed off. Every small sound felt closer now, more deliberate. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock. Ivy's breathing through the baby monitor, steady and light. Claire lay awake on her side, facing the doorway. Nolan wasn't asleep. He lay just beyond the bedroom threshold, body angled toward Ivy's room, eyes open. Not wide, not anxious. Awake in a way that felt purposeful. Claire whispered, "You okay, buddy?" Nolan didn't turn his head. She closed her eyes and tried to rest, but the day replayed in fragments. The spill, the book, the gate, the way Nolan had stood before anything looked wrong. Minutes stretched. Then Ivy shifted. Not a cry, not even a sound loud enough to register fully, just a small change in rhythm, something off. Nolan stood instantly. Claire's eyes opened at the same moment. Her heart was already racing. What is it? Nolan walked down the hallway and stopped at the nursery doorway. Claire followed. Ivy was still asleep, but her position had changed. She'd rolled slightly, her face angled too close to the mattress edge, her breathing quieter than it should have been. Claire's breath caught. Oh my God. She adjusted Ivy gently, lifting her chin and rolling her back into a safer position. Ivy inhaled deeply and settled, her breathing evening out. Claire sank into the chair beside the crib, shaking. I didn't see that. Mark stood behind her, pale. Neither did I. Nolan sat at the doorway, watching. After that, everything narrowed. It wasn't about furniture or spills anymore. It was about one dog and one baby. Everything else fell away. Claire stopped checking the monitor. She watched Nolan. If Nolan lifted his head, she paid attention. If Nolan stood, she moved. Time behaved strangely, stretching, compressing. Sound sharpened. Silence felt heavier, like it was waiting. At some point, Mark whispered, "I'm going to get water." Nolan's ears flicked. Mark froze. "I'll wait," he said quietly. Claire felt tears sting in her eyes. "He keeps knowing," she whispered. "Before we do." They stayed where they were. Near dawn, Ivy made another small sound, barely more than a breath. Nolan was already standing. Claire reached the crib in seconds. Ivy's breathing had shifted again, uneven, shallow. Claire scooped her up immediately. Ivy fussed, then cried, strong, indignant, alive. Relief hit Claire so hard she had to sit on the floor, her back against the crib. Nolan sat back down, calm, not finished. Morning arrived pale and thin. Claire sat on the living room floor with Ivy in her lap, rocking gently. Nolan lay nearby, upright, tracking every small movement Ivy made. "He didn't sleep," Claire whispered. Mark rubbed his face. "Neither did we." As the day unfolded, the pattern continued. If Ivy's breathing changed, Nolan noticed first. If Ivy leaned too far, Nolan adjusted his position. If Claire hesitated, Nolan acted. By midday, Claire realized something that made her chest tighten. She wasn't watching Ivy anymore. She was watching Nolan. She noticed it when she caught herself waiting for Nolan to relax before allowing herself to breathe. "He's become our warning," she whispered. Mark nodded slowly, and he hasn't been wrong. Nolan didn't lie down all day. Not once. He stayed upright, alert, as if rest were something he couldn't afford yet. As evening approached, the focus narrowed even further. One dog, one child. Everything else receded into the background. Claire sat beside Nolan and rested her hand lightly on his shoulder. "You're tired," she murmured. Nolan didn't move, because whatever he was listening for hadn't arrived yet. And in his stillness, there was no fear, only readiness. The danger arrived quietly. No crash, no scream, no warning that felt urgent enough to demand attention. Claire was in the kitchen rinsing Ivy's bottle when Nolan stood so fast his nails scraped sharply against the floor. The sound cut through the house like something snapping. Her head lifted instantly. "Nolan?" He didn't look at her. He was staring down the hallway, toward Ivy. Ivy sat on the rug near the doorway, legs splayed comfortably, chewing on the corner of a soft toy. Her face was relaxed, happy, still smiling. Everything looked safe. Nolan barked once, short, sharp, different from before. Claire's stomach dropped. She ran. Mark turned at the same time. "What is it?" Claire saw it as she reached the hallway. The ceiling vent. It sat just above the doorway, something they'd never thought about, never questioned. The cover was old, painted over, installed years before Ivy existed. Now, as Claire looked up, she noticed the screws. One was missing, another hung loose. The vent cover sagged slightly, just enough to be wrong. Before she could reach Ivy, Nolan moved. He crossed the space in a blur and slammed his body sideways into Ivy, knocking her backward onto the rug. Ivy cried out, startled, her toy flying from her hands. At the exact same moment, the vent cover tore free. It dropped straight down. Metal, weight, gravity. It slammed into the tile where Ivy had been sitting less than half a second earlier, shattering against the floor with a sharp, echoing crash. Silence followed. Then Ivy screamed, loud, furious, alive. Claire collapsed to her knees and grabbed her, hands shaking violently as she checked her head, her arms, her legs. Oh my God, are you okay?" Ivy wailed, face red, lungs full. Mark stood frozen, staring at the wreckage, twisted metal, broken screws, dust drifting through the air. His voice broke, that would have hit her. Nolan stood nearby, chest rising and falling, eyes locked on the fallen vent. Claire looked at him through tears. "You saved her," she whispered. "You saved my baby." Her voice cracked completely. "Thank you." Nolan's tail moved once. Then he sat, watching. The house felt shattered now, dust in the air, the sharp smell of disturbed drywall, the quiet ringing after impact. Claire carried Ivy into the living room and sat on the floor, rocking her until her cries softened into hiccups. Then slow, steady breaths. Nolan followed and lay down in front of them, not blocking, not guarding, just there. Later this After Mark secured the ceiling opening and emergency services confirmed the vent had failed due to corroded fasteners, the house settled into a different kind of quiet. Not peaceful, grateful. Claire sat on the couch with Ivy asleep against her chest, her small hand curled into Claire's shirt. Nolan lay on the floor nearby, finally resting, eyes closed, but one ear still tuned to the room. Mark sat beside her, staring at nothing. She was safe, he said quietly. She really was. Claire nodded, tears slipping free again, until he stood up. She looked down at Nolan, her voice barely audible. You saw it before it happened. Nolan didn't stir. He didn't need praise. He hadn't panicked. He had decided. And because of that decision, a baby who never knew she was in danger slept on. She was safe. The room was calm. Until the dog stood up and placed himself between a baby and everything that was about to fall.